Welcome to the Uplevel Dairy Podcast. This is the podcast for dairy owners, managers, and their trusted advisors who are looking to take themselves and their businesses to their next level of performance, resilience, and success in the dairy farming business. I'm your host, Peggy, and it's my mission to bring you the stories and thought leaders to help take you to your next up level. Hey there, friends of the Uplevel Dairy Podcast. Thank you for listening to this episode. And before we get into the meat and potatoes of today's episode, talking all about RNG projects for dairy, I wanted to invite you in on a very special giveaway. So this month of April, if you go to upleveldairy.com and subscribe to receive our emails, you will be eligible for winning an awesome gift box with some great things that dairy managers and any of us in this industry would love. And here's a little sneak peek. If you are watching the video version, you can see right now that there's this customized cell phone holder that says Uplevel Dairy, great for propping up on your desk and holding your phone. There is one of the books recommended in Jay Joy's book club. The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team is going out in the April gift box. And my friend Elizabeth at 4D Egg has hooked us up with waterproof bibs in an assortment of sizes so that we can find the right fit for the winner of our April giveaway. And so just head on over to upleveldairy.com, go to that little subscribe tab and fill in your email address. What you'll receive is an announcement every time our weekly podcast comes out, as well as the weekly blog, and you'll be eligible to win the special gift box from Uplevel Dairy. And so now we'll get into the meat of this conversation today. And if one of the most critical decisions on your mind right now as a dairy producer revolves around signing on to an RNG project for your dairy, you might be wondering, how do you know if these companies are legit or just fly by night? Are some of these contracts too good to be true? And how will a project impact not just the daily management of your dairy, but also your bottom line? These are the big questions on the minds of many dairy producers. And so I've lined up a power panel for you today that will cover 3 aspects of RNG contracts, from the legal side, the financial side, and the day-to-day dairy management side. So in this episode of the Uplevel Dairy Podcast, we welcome attorney Susan LaCrosse of LaCrosse Law Office, dairy digester consultant Dr. Bob Nagel of Westwind Solutions, and our monthly podcast partner and good friend Jay Joy of Bridgeforth LLP, our in-house expert on all things dairy finance and family business. Welcome to the Uplevel Dairy Podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having me, Peggy.
And Susan, I'm going to kick off with you. I have a few questions lined out for you, but just for a moment, introduce yourself to our audience of listeners, a little bit about who you are and your connections that are very deeply tied into the dairy community.
Yes, thank you, Peggy. I grew up born and raised in Kewaunee County, Wisconsin. I grew up on a dairy farm. We were milking probably at the top about 100 cows in a stanchion barn, but we worked like slaves. And then I was employed throughout my high school years at some other farms in the community as well. Got my law degree, worked in private practice, and then I started the bulk of my career working at Bay Lake Bank, which is now Nagel National Bank. And right after the bank merged, I joined on with Nagel for a very short stint, and then I worked for John Pagel. And I have started my own practice now as of January 2021, but deeply rooted in the agricultural community. And again, my passion with farming goes very deep with my roots, with my family history and whatnot, and just glad to be a part of this and to be able to help out farmers.
Well, thanks for having me today, Peggy. My background is I'm actually from a dairy farm in Wisconsin. I have a little bit of a varied education. I have an undergraduate degree in biochemistry. I worked for 3M for a little while as an organic chemist. I have a master's degree in molecular biology from Missouri, and then a veterinary degree from the University of Madison. I have practiced for a little while, and then joined in with Wholesome Dairies in Hilbert, Wisconsin, was a managing partner there for 14 years. And during that time there, built our own RNG facility, as well as what they call a decant facility, where we have 4 other dairies bring their gas in and unload into the pipeline. And then have since stepped down from the day-to-day role of that, and am consulting with dairies on RNG projects, both from just understanding things all the way through to helping them see the bigger picture and possibly develop their own. I've got a couple that will be farmer-owned developed projects.
So yeah, dairy is near and dear to your heart, and you do a lot of work in the dairy community. And you look at these documents and contracts from RNG companies to dairy farmers. You look at them pretty often, and you're always looking at them with that best interest of the dairy farmer in mind. Like that's your roots. That's where you come from. But my question for you is, what questions should a dairy farmer ask before signing up with an RNG company?
So I think some just basic fundamental questions that I want to start with. And often I think these are overlooked, or maybe the farmer just doesn't realize that they can actually ask these questions. But when the RNG company is starting their due diligence with the farmer, they're going to be asking the farmer a lot of questions. They're going to be asking for their financials. They're going to be talking with the farmer's financial partners. They're going to be asking for history of the farm, lots of different things. So why can't that be mutual? And that's what it should be. The farmer should be asking those exact same questions of the RNG company. I mean, this is a significant endeavor that's going to be coming on the farmer's property. So what they want to do is they want to make sure that this RNG company has the financial viability to be able to pull it off. So in turn, they should be looking at the financials of the RNG company, or they should be looking if they've got, sometimes these are startup companies, whether they have financial backers, looking at the financials of those backers as well. I think another thing that farmers sometimes overlook, when you're in these meetings, they bring out the salespeople and it sounds all warm and fuzzy and everything sounds great. And that's wonderful, but you need to talk to references. You need to talk to other farmers that have been involved in these projects. And a lot of these companies have done projects of this nature, but have they done it with other farmers? So that's really important, that talking with other farmers that have worked with this company, ask about how many different dairy projects of this nature have they completed, the duration that it took to get these projects operational, what types of issues were there, what type of successes, making sure that they have a solid understanding of it. I think character too, really looking at the integrity of this company and the people that you're talking with. Make sure that when you're meeting with these companies, that you're not just meeting with the salesmen, you're meeting with the people that are the decision makers, that you're meeting with the folks that are going to be the boots on the ground, so that you know exactly. I mean, look at this contract. These contracts are very, very long-term contracts. So think of it as a marriage. You want it to be built on mutuality and trust. And then I think the other thing too, Peggy, that's really important is asking about the intentions of the company. What are they going to be doing? Are they going to be selling this project, or are they going to be keeping it for the long term? And I'm not saying that if their intent is to sell the project, that's going to be a deal breaker. But again, if we're talking about mutuality here, there has to be transparency. And what you want is on the front end, a very clear understanding as a farmer, what exactly their intention is. And this is where, when you do get your attorney involved to help you with the project, you're building in language into that contract to protect you, because you now just spent all this time looking at the financial viability of this particular company and looking at, talking to references. Well, now if they go to sell it to somebody else, you want to make sure you have that opportunity to do the same thing with that other company.
Yeah. So, Susan, what it seems like you've laid out here is encouraging any dairy farmer to do as much diligence and homework on the people they're working with, in very much the same way that some of these companies are asking these dairies for their financials and checking their viability. It's doing the same thing back, right?
Exactly. It's 100% doing the same thing back.
Yeah. And so when you think about the people from your team that should be involved in these conversations and these bigger decisions, who do you recommend has a seat at the table when it comes to making these long-term decisions for signing into an RNG project?
So first and foremost, you want to make sure that your banker's at the table. That's a key partner. There's a few reasons for that. Number one, the RNG company, as a general rule of thumb, is going to be asking for a security interest in the farmer's manure. And what that means is the RNG company wants to make sure nobody else has rights to that manure, that only they will have exclusive rights to it. But what I think a lot of people overlook is when their banker, they securitize their loan, one of the things that they're securitizing it with is all assets of the farmers, everything that they have. And the manure is an asset. I've never seen this ever be an issue. But again, transparency, get it out on the table. Just make sure that that's everybody's aware, and that the banker has no issues with the RNG company getting the rights to the manure. Secondly, the RNG company, again, as a general rule of thumb, they're going to be putting their plant on the farmer's property. So they're going to be leasing a piece of the farmer's land where it's going to be located. To protect the RNG company, because the bank has a mortgage on that property, the RNG company is going to request what's called as a basic terminology, a non-disturbance agreement. So in the unfortunate event, if the farmer was ever to be foreclosed on by the bank, that the RNG company is not going to be their interest foreclosed out as well. So what they ask of the bank is, hey, we want you to sign this document that as long as we're abiding by the terms of the agreement with the farmer, that you're not going to disrupt us. And so generally what happens when a foreclosure occurs, I know you had Paul on your show at one point in time, people like Paulie would come in and assist the bank in continuing to operate the farm. And that way the RNG plant would continue to operate as normal. And then they have this agreement signed with the bank that they're not going to be disturbed. And then thirdly, when the RNG company puts all of their structure and all of their equipment onto this piece of property, it kind of, from a legal perspective, it changes the character of that property. And maybe at one point was personal property, and now because it's affixed to the land, it becomes real property. So again, from a legal perspective, the bank would have rights to that real property. So generally, the RNG company is going to ask that the farmer get from their bank an agreement that states that that property retains the character as personal property, and it's the property of the RNG company and not the farmers. So again, just a few different things that you want to make sure that the banker is involved and they're kind of vetting and doing their due diligence as well to make sure that they're comfortable with those things. The second party that I think is really important to get to the table, and I think is often an overlooked party, is your insurance agent. Making sure, so when you're looking at these RNG contracts, the first how many pages are going to be the nuts and bolts of the agreement. But then you get to the back half of the contract, and that's a lot of people refer to as boilerplate language. Well, there's a lot of important provisions in those boilerplate language, and one of them is the insurance requirements. I've seen contracts where the RNG company does not have to provide the farmer with any certificate of insurance proving up they have insurance. Well, that's obviously not protecting the farmer. So the key thing is getting your insurance agent involved and making sure that they're looking at the scope of this project and what would be appropriate coverages for the RNG company to have. Generally, there's going to be a mutuality provision, so the farmer is going to have some insurance in place as well and provide the RNG company with certificates of insurance. And I think what's important there is making sure that whatever the RNG company is requesting is something that the farmer can actually have. I had a situation once with a farmer that the coverages were so stringent and the limits were so high, my farmer would have been in default right out of the gate had that not been looked at. And so, of course, then we renegotiated that and made sure that we got appropriate coverages in place. And then I think a third party that I think is really important to get to the table is your CAFO representative. I know a lot of farmers, they have the mindset, well, plans and specs are going to have to go to the DNR for review because, these are reviewable structures and stuff like that, like the transfer lines. But the reality is you have a CAFO permit and your representative may not even necessarily know some of this stuff is happening. So I think it's really important just to get them in on the front end and make sure that they're aware of what's going on and see if that changes any of the dynamics of with your permit, if there's any other type of reporting requirements or stuff like that with the farm. And I know sometimes a lot of these RNG companies will slip in that they can take manure from other farms. Again, making sure that that's permissible with under your permit and to something that the farmer actually wants to be doing.
I'll add in there, Peggy, on that it's important for the CAFO representative because a lot of these are based off of cow numbers and making sure that the CAFO representatives are comfortable with those cow numbers and that all still is compliant.
Yeah, thank you for adding that, Bob. And so what we're hearing here is people that should have a seat at this table with the dairy producer as you're looking at these contracts, making this decision, the banker, the insurance agent to really look at the provision and protecting the farm from, those risks, and also the person that's involved in your permitting. So I want to lean into that a little bit more. And I think both of you, Dr. Bob and Susan, can have something to say about this one. So we talked just for a moment here about that ownership of manure as an asset to the dairy. But then what about liability? Because I mean, we know sometimes with manure, accidents happen. And so, when we're thinking about trucking manure, moving manure, and everything that could go wrong in that process, there's a point of liability too. Speak about that for a second. Where does that liability fall between the farm and the RNG company?
So from my perspective as an attorney, what I'm looking at, so the farmer ultimately is a responsible party for the manure. But what we want to do to build into the contract to protect the farmer is making sure that when that manure is passing through the RNG company's facility, when they're ultimately handling the manure, you want to make sure that you've got provisions within that agreement, that there's an indemnification and hold harmless. That way, if something would arise with that manure when the RNG company is handling it, that the farmer then has that ability to go back to that RNG company and recoup their costs and whatnot.
Yeah. And Dr. Bob, anything from your perspective to add there?
No, I think that the indemnification is critical. Ultimately, the community is going to be focused on the dairy as the source of that issue. So wanting to work with someone that will shoulder up and help when there is an issue that arises is critical.
Yeah. And so let's for a second get into some of the nuts and bolts of contracts. Susan, I'm sure you have seen it all. And same thing with you, Bob, as well, when you're sitting down having these conversations about digesters and contracts. And so, Susan, from your perspective, and Bob, feel free to weigh in on this one too. What should a contract include? What's a winning contract look like for the dairy farmer?
So I think just some key basic things, I guess, to make sure. Number one is the length of the contract. Make sure that is spelled out. And I know that goes without saying, but it's amazing sometimes what you see in draft agreements. So again, making sure there's a clear understanding. And I think one piece that's really important is a lot of times the farmers sign the contract and they think, okay, this is a 20-year contract. It starts day one when I sign the agreement. That is not true. It starts when the facility is operational. So making sure that you understand when that operational start date is. A lot of, and again, I've seen mixed bags on this, but you want to make sure that there's some end date in there so that the RNG facility has to be operational by a certain date. The farmer has to be, again, when you're dealing with a marriage, there has to be mutuality. This is a benefit for both parties. So you want to make sure that you're working with the RNG company when you're trying to fix a date. Right now, lead times on RNG equipment are about 60 weeks. I said that wrong, 60 weeks. So when you're talking, there's a lead time of over a year, you have to make sure that you're allowing them not only to get that equipment, do their engineering, whatnot, but also putting in the equipment. So I think as a general rule of thumb right now, probably 22 to 24 months, that facility should be operational. Again, just something to be looking at to make sure. And as an attorney, I would build in a date into that contract that if the facility is not operational by that date, it's an out for the farmer. And I'm not saying that the farmer is actually going to get out at that point in time, but it's at least giving the farmer control and that opportunity to, if they see that the RNG company is working in good faith to get this facility operational, of course, the farmer has the ability to give them more time, but you don't want it lingering into perpetuity that there is no end date. I think some other things to make sure that the farmer is going to want to be looking for is the ability to get out of that contract without being penalized. So there's going to be provisions in the contract that if, the RNG company would end up terminating, or if the farmer had to terminate, then the farmer is going to have to pay the RNG company back X amount of dollars. But there's got to be some provisions built into that contract for the farmer that they can get out without being penalized. So Dr. Bob had referred to the number of animals. So the farm is going to have to produce X amount of manure for the RNG facility, and they're looking at a constant flow of manure that is coming to them. If for some reason that the farmer can no longer keep that herd size, whether it be for economic reasons or for regulatory reasons, the laws change, whatnot, the farmer has to make sure that they have an ability to get out of that. And then there's other things, and this too goes without saying, and the farmer's attorney is going to help them with this, but just making sure that if the RNG company is not operating in a prudent fashion, being responsible, following the rules, laws, and regulations, or if there'd be a bankruptcy or insolvency or something to that effect, that the farmer has the ability to get out, and again, getting out without being penalized. I think another important topic too is payments. So the farmer is either going to be paid a royalty stream, or they might get upfront payments, or they may get a combination of both. Again, I'm a person where I really encourage dialogue and conversation between the parties to make sure that there is that meeting of the minds. And I think a lot of times, farmers, again, you have this initial discussion and you're going to get this large payment if you're getting, say, an upfront payment, and it's very exciting. But now in the contract, you got to make sure that you understand when that payment is actually going to be made. And then two, when it comes to the royalties, making sure you understand when those royalties are going to start. And I know a lot of your RNG companies, there might be a little bit of contention when it comes to royalties, that they may not have a set start date in the agreement, because what they're trying to do is establish the farm's carbon intensity score, and they're trying to maximize the amount of dollars that are going to be coming in for royalties for the farmer in both and the RNG company as well. So sometimes you may have to kind of give a little bit as to if there's a date in the agreement or not. But the moral of the story is making sure that that discussion is happening on the front end, so the farmer has a very, very clear understanding as to how that's all going to pan out. And then I guess as it relates to payments too, something else that the farmer should be cognizant about is, are there any clawback provisions that RNG company can get those payments back? Again, just making sure that there's understanding of that. I think another topic to make sure that's laid out in the contract is ownership of the equipment, and then maintenance of the equipment going forward. So who is putting in the equipment, who owns it, who's responsible for maintaining it, just making sure that you're also understanding exactly what is needed for the project. So as an example, if a farmer has satellite sites and that manure has to be brought to the main facility, how is that manure going to be getting brought to the main facility? Whose dime is that on? What infrastructure is needed to accomplish that, if any? Just different things like that. And then lastly, I think just the contingencies we already had touched on. In the event the RNG company is sold, again, your attorney is going to build the farmer's language around to protect the farmer, so that the RNG company is not going to just be able to sell that facility without the approval of the farmer. But I also think the other side also holds true. What if the farmer wants to get out? What if the farmer wants to sell the facility? Making sure that there's language built into that contract that permits the farmer to do that. Because as a general rule of thumb, your assignment language is going to say that the RNG company can assign the facility, assign that contract without approval from the farmer. And then they're going to say that the farmer cannot assign the contract, period. So again, making sure there's a meeting of the minds and making sure that there's language built into that contract to protect the farmer.
Yeah. And so what I'm hearing from you, Susan, on this, like you said, it's building in these protections and options for these long terms, because some of these contracts are anywhere from 10, 20, 30 years in length.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so we're looking at big decisions that will affect the producer that's signing them for their lifetime in some cases. And if they're looking at having another generation coming into the dairy, something that will affect them for the years to come too.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that's where I think the farmer just has to be very global. And this is where you're getting the right partner at the table to kind of help you to vet. And this is when we talk about even the banker and the insurance agent and even the CAFO representative coming in. These people have dealt with other farmers that have probably done this, and they probably have a lot of insight of different things to be looking for. Again, at the front end, when you're negotiating this contracting, looking at the letter of intent as well, it's all warm and fuzzy, but you got to be global to think about all these different issues of potential things that could happen, and making sure that is covered. And obviously the attorney assisting the farmer is going to be able to really vet and help the farmer go through that stuff.
Susan, thank you for giving us that global perspective and that bigger view of how to build in these protections and build in a plan and a contract that can be longstanding for the future and viability of the dairy farm as a business. And now I'll switch over to Dr. Bob Nagel. So Dr. Bob, you've been kind of a pioneer in this wild west of RNG, and it sounds like you were probably one of the people that started learning about these processes early on. on through your work at Wholesome. And so, Bob, I have heard you say that your mission with Westwind Solutions and your consultancy is to make sure that these projects don't fail. And so, in this vast experience that you have, just start out, can you share an example of like one of those stories where things just didn't go well, like the nightmare story where everything went wrong when it came to a dairy that got involved in a project and a contract, something that the rest of us can learn something from?
Yeah, there's a lot of little details that make these projects successful or not successful, and from the early on days, my worry has been that if they don't go well, they're a real black eye for the dairy, both from the community standpoint as well as from the lender standpoint. Lenders would be nervous on these projects if they don't do well. A lot of developers have not understood the workings of a dairy. These projects are originally, a lot of developers worked on landfill projects prior, and very different set of parameters to make them work. They don't understand the cash flows of these systems, and so that has been one that I have seen multiple times. As projects will get started, developers won't understand the cash flow situation and run out of money before they are able to get to paying farmers. So that has been a theme that has happened multiple times. I've also seen projects get built where the projects end up impacting dairy operations, and to me they should work together. And when we start having to significantly change operations on a dairy farm, we need to rethink how these systems are structured.
Yeah, and Bob, you would know what you're looking for in these cases because you've been involved in that day-to-day farm management too. So you see and understand what's important to keep the dairy doing business as usual and where some of these interruptions can occur. But what I'm hearing from you with some of the stories where things didn't go well with the project, it was maybe because of a lack of experience that the company had on the dairy side to begin with, and then also just running into the I'd almost call it expectation setting with when a project is actually up and able to make money and able to pay back the farmer. That kind of lays back into what Susan was talking about earlier with these contracts and setting expectations, right? Is there a correlation between those two things there?
Absolutely. Many of the contracts I have read talk about the royalty payments happening after the project either returns their revenue or is even the project has returned all of their capital investment, and people need to understand those subtleties in that, and that's where someone like Susan can make a big difference in helping you understand it. But typically, from the date you start running a system and injecting gas until first payments, minimum of 10 months and can be 14, 16 months depending on how the projects go. And so that can be a significant window of time, depending on how people are expecting to be paid.
Yeah. And then if we put, on top of that, what Susan had articulated before about the lead time for getting a project from start to finish up and ready to go, well over a year. So now we're looking at, in many cases, would you say a good 2-year chunk of time between the initial signatures and the contract and the let's get this project rolling to when that moment when the producer is able to actually generate an income from? We're looking at, in some cases, 2 years. Is that a good number to have in our minds, would you say?
I would say at least 2 years. I think 3 is probably a more realistic number by the time they, do due diligence, equipment delays, getting all of their designs and stuff before they start constructing. All of that takes time.
Yeah, yeah. And Bob, you alluded to another thing just a moment ago, and that was one of the things that you've seen go wrong is when the system doesn't jive with day-to-day management on the dairy. And so let's step into that a little bit more. And what kind of questions, what kind of things should the dairy farmer be thinking about and asking that RNG partner about when it comes to farm management and how to keep business as usual going so that, cows are getting milked and healthy, employees are able to work safely and efficiently, and you're able to bring in a system and make this a part of your dairy operation that isn't adding a ton of stress and interruption to the way you do things every day.
Well, that's well said, Peggy. as someone who's managed dairies, there can be a lot of stress when things are interrupted. Cows like that routine, right? And so making sure that we're not changing that on the dairy side is critical. And so, Susan alluded to it earlier about, talking with other projects that the developers have been involved with, and really understanding, interviewing those people and making sure that they've had a good experience. I think it's also really critical that if a farm is going to go into these projects, they need to be involved in the project all the way through. How is the manure going to flow? What are our options for bypass when things happen? What kind of disruptions will happen? How do we, if we have an issue, for example, if we're going to convert from sand to solids and we're struggling with mastitis, what's our thoughts? How are we going to adjust? What are we going to do?
Yeah, so a lot of that pre-planning. Have you seen? So I'll step back. So I was just talking with a producer last week that has a system that he's putting up that's going to allow them to actually continue to use sand. Hopefully, if everything goes well. And I said, well, let me check with you in about 6 months, and we'll see if this is working as well as it sounds like it should after you've been in it for a while. But it sounds like there may be some options where, dairies that don't want to make a total bedding switch, where they may be able to stay on sand if that's important to them in their system. Have you seen, what have you seen as far as, requirements to switch to biosolids and, be able to reuse those dried solids as bedding versus being able to keep sand for those that might want that in their system to be something that stays?
Yeah. I've seen the gamut. There are some development companies that are willing to work with sand and figure out how to manage through that with the dairies. I would say the majority of companies are pretty hardline that they want to go to a biosolid system and get sand completely out of their dynamic. For dairies that have been on sand and have been very successful with sand, that is a significant change that definitely will take a learning curve. Can be done. It can be done very well and have good cow comfort, but certainly is something that you got to pay attention to as you venture into it.
Yeah. So, okay, Bob. So when it comes to day-to-day dairy management and in all of the instances that you've seen and experienced with these sort of projects, would you say that the bedding and the handling of that and the maintenance and then, implications on the cow side for those switching to biosolids, is that the biggest interruption that you see most often in business as usual? Or are there other things that come up that maybe dairy producers aren't expecting that are impacting their ability to work as efficiently and keep that clock running, 24/7, 365? Because dairies don't stop. So an interruption can be a big deal, right?
Absolutely. I think, if they're changing bedding type, that is a significant thing. If they've already been on biosolids or they're staying on sand, then the next question for me is how about manure flows and how does that work? Will we, if we're a flush flume dairy, will we have flush water on a continuous basis? Or, when the digester gas upgrader goes down, does that change our volume of flush water? Simple things that until you've really worked through them, you may not be aware of, but can have significant impacts, right? If you're a flume dairy and suddenly you go 6 hours with no flume water, that can change management quickly.
Yeah. Add to some stress, some headaches, and definitely cause some interruptions in the system. That what you just laid out there, Bob, was a great example of those things that producers can be thinking about. Anything else that comes up that can be an interrupter in the day-to-day flow?
The other factor is some of the companies would like the dairies to be involved in managing the digester itself. Other companies have taken over that management. Making sure you understand what kind of commitment you're getting into there is critical. You have to have somebody, if you're going to be involved in helping oversee the digester portion of that for a company, you have to have someone committed that's willing to do that. That system, just like a parlor, has to run 24/7, has to work, has to be preventively maintained. So those are critical. There is definitely ongoing information gathering that needs to happen with these. Cow counts, by classification will be stuff that the companies will need to help verify credits for the renewable attributes. Those aren't really intrusive once you get a system up and going, but people need to understand that they'll have to work together with the development company long term, and it's not just only the manure connection is the only interaction that they'll have.
Yeah, and I think you just underscored some of what Susan was sharing earlier when it comes to, assigning the responsibility and longevity of how these projects will work. And so, I guess another question I have, for both of you is, we talked about these contracts, 10, 20, 30 years. What happens when they're up? What should producers be considering from the management standpoint, ownership standpoint, long-term picture? What happens when that contract expires? What's the forward thinking that should be taking place there?
From my perspective, there should be an exit plan always in place on a contract. And so that applies to this as well. What's the exit plan? Will the dairy have an opportunity to buy the digester if they want to? If they don't want to, is it going to be removed? Is it going to be structured so that we can bypass and return back to pre-digester operations? Those things need to be laid out on the front end when everybody's excited about the project and the negotiations are easy and straightforward. To have that discussion once cement is poured is a tough conversation.
Susan, anything to add there?
No, that's 100% spot on. It's making sure, again, I always say it's that meeting of the minds, that transparency, because you have to have that global approach to looking at everything. It's all rosy right now, but what happens if this event would arise? And then, making sure that the farmer has a say. A lot of times I see it in the agreements, it's very one-sided, that the RNG plant can decide whether they keep it there or they're not. And again, the farmer's got to have a say as to exactly what's happening. And if the intent is for it to stay there, that all of those environmental attributes are assigned back to the farm. So if the farmer would choose to continue with the project, then they have that ability to do that.
Susan, if I can interrupt, that brings up a point that I've seen as of late in contracts that is the scope of the attributes. I think that is something that I think farms should be aware of as well. What are they signing off for? Scope. I've seen some where they potentially are selling off all of the future fertilizer or Lord knows what may be coming down the road attributes that I think at least awareness should be said.
Yeah. And okay, so Bob, from your perspective, when you see those things come up in contracts, is that a red flag or an opportunity?
I think it can be either way. If the company is willing to work and understand and define their scopes, I think it can be a very good thing for the dairy as well as for the RNG company. But to have a blanket statement of all attributes of any sort are sole ownership of the development company XYZ, that puts the farm at an economic disadvantage long term.
Mm-hmm. And so this goes back, as Susan has talked about earlier, with doing that diligence to really, really comb through those contracts and make sure that you're having conversation, not just with the person that sat down and did the deal and sold the project to you, but the people that will be making those decisions and that you'll be interacting with from that company side. Is that correct, Susan?
That is correct. Yeah, you definitely want to make sure, because again, salesmen, they can make everything warm and fuzzy and great. You want to make sure that you're meeting with those decision makers as well, and you have an understanding of who they are, because that interaction is going to hold through during the duration of that agreement. And you want to know, again, it's a marriage, so you want to make sure who these players are and that you're comfortable with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we've talked about, some of these projects and stories, the things that maybe didn't go well or things to watch out for. But I'm curious, a question I want to toss out to both of you is, can you share an example of a project on a dairy that you're working with that is going really well? What elements make something like this a win-win on the producer side?
I'll start operationally. Having brought those people early into the conversation, as Susan said, when the salespeople are still in the situation, has made a big difference on some of the systems I've been involved with. The contract was set up with both parties thinking this is the way the system would go, only to realize, and the example I'm thinking of, volume of recycled water back to the digester was fairly significant. And so both parties came back to the table and said, okay, there's benefit here that's potentially for both of us. And they renegotiated their contract and aimed it so that both parties were winning together. Because in my mind, you're either winning together or losing together. Because if one party's winning and one party's losing, somebody's leaving the sandbox and going home.
Yeah.
So to me, to be able to have that working relationship where they were willing to sit back down after the ink's been dried and both of them say, yep, let's just renegotiate this and keep it going, is impressive. They've done a nice job of building mutual trust.
Yeah, absolutely. And Susan, what Bob just explained, it comes back to some of the initial conversation that you brought up about doing that diligence and researching the company and checking their references for other dairies that they've worked with. Because that's where some of these conversations could come up and direct you in one way or another as to whether or not there is the ability to have those conversations, those renegotiations, and really have everyone moving on the same page going forward.
No, absolutely. And I Bob, that was so well put, what you just said. It's having that ability, again, that partnership together and being able to ebb and flow, because sometimes you can't account for every single thing that's going to happen. And if something has to be modified, knowing that other partner, they're looking out for you. And again, it's a mutuality thing, because this is for the benefit of both parties. So that is absolutely critical, that there is that good partnership between the parties.
Yeah. And so Susan and Bob, we've been able to sit down and have this legal perspective and digging into the contracts and the partners and all of that with looking at RNG projects. And Dr. Bob, you've brought in this on-farm perspective and your many years of working with digesters and on dairies. That's very realistic and boots on the ground. And so what questions do you guys have for each other, or any comments that you would have about what the other one shared that it'd be good for dairy producers out there listening to hear?
I think the main advice that I would have for anybody is and again, if you think of it from a relationship perspective, whether it's a marriage, a friendship, whatever, it doesn't matter. This is a relationship. Don't be afraid to ask questions. And even I cannot begin to emphasize that enough. Ask questions. No question is dumb. Some of the stuff is new to them as well. And get it out on the table and just really try to develop that relationship in that way. And as the contract, and Dr. Bob hit on this very well put before, no one knows that farm better than that farmer. So don't assume these people know everything. Make sure as a farmer, you're involved in that construction process every step along the way and helping guide and make the decisions, because that's, again, that relationship, that partnership together is what's going to build something very successful. And if, the RNG company just goes out carte blanche and does whatever they want and the farmer is by the sidelines, that, now you may run into issues, and that may be some of those not very successful stories. So again, building that partnership.
Yeah. Thank you, Susan. And Dr. Bob, any other comments from you, from your perspective?
I would say communication on all of these is key. I've been amazed when I've worked at Wholesome, we worked with the pipeline company, large company, elbow deep in engineers. But when we've approached them and said, hey, we think this is how we'd like to approach this, they've been very, very willing and open when they've understood the situation. Early on in our project, they had issues with their monitoring equipment. Would have been a deal breaker for us to inject if they didn't know what the gas quality was. But we had the conversation early on and said, we'd like to share data back and forth. And we are buying the same equipment you bought. So we went 6 months with them using all of our data to allow us to inject. And had we not had that set up and conversation ahead of time, it'd have been a much different situation. But they were very, very willing to work with us on it when we educated them and approached it in a reasonable manner.
Jay, we've heard from Susan, we've heard from Bob, and I'm curious for you in your position, what has been your experience working with dairies and these conversations around RNG projects?
Well, I mean, it seems like it's a little bit of a modern day gold rush, when you're talking dairy RNG. So I think half the battle is kind of sifting and sorting through all the various, people, parties, companies that are out there, as potential options to either own and operate these dairy RNG facilities or, be involved in the development of a project. So I think half the battle is just, like I said, kind of sifting and sorting through, who are the ones that are quote unquote legitimate and who are the ones that are a little bit fly by night or maybe don't have, all their I's dotted and T's crossed, in order to fully put and fund one of these projects, because these are not small dollar projects. These are multi-million-dollar projects in a lot of cases. So, it's great to have a lot of interest and a lot of people interested in this type of activity, for the dairy industry. But with that, interest is only part of it. At the end of the day, the capital and the funding has to be there to make these projects come to fruition. So I guess that's been my experience is we're so new on the front side of this thing that it does take a little bit of time and energy to sift and sort through and pick the legitimate ones from maybe the less than legitimate ones.
Yeah. And as you alluded to, Jay, these are huge financial investments. These are huge capital projects. And so, I mean, you wear a few different hats on the dairy, right? As a family business advisor, you're having these conversations about long-term future. And as a fractional CFO, you are looking at the financial picture. And so when you get brought in to talk with a dairy farm family or dairy farming business about participating in a project, what are some of the things that you look for in a partnership that will benefit your client's financial picture?
Well, I think first and foremost, and I mentioned it in my previous comment, is knowing where the ultimate capital to finance the project is coming from. That's a big piece, right? So it doesn't do any good to really talk about, how's this going to look? How's this going to work? If at the end of the day, the party that you're talking to doesn't have the financing lined up to be able to execute. So I guess to me, that's like the first hurdle. Secondly, I'm a big proponent in kind of a little bit of a hybrid type arrangement when it comes to, the flows of dollars on these projects. I don't necessarily think that having, all the future cash flow on this project, quote unquote, front loaded. So there's a huge upfront payment to the dairy, and then there's not this, recurring annuity or royalty stream, based upon the performance of the project. I like kind of a mix of both, a little bit of upfront and then some participation in the performance of the project itself. It aligns everybody's interests. I think those projects that have that type of a structure long-term are going to be more successful because at the end of the day, both the dairy and the dairy RNG operator are concerned about efficiency and maximizing the productivity of gas production and to generate as much revenue off the project as possible. So if you can tie kind of those interests together, to me, that's the ideal long-term scenario.
Yeah, the win-win on both sides.
Yep.
Yeah. And so Jay, thank you for sharing that. And I think that goes back to a lot of the comments that Susan had made as well about looking for those right partners. And I want to revisit an episode of the podcast that we did a few months back where you talked about the book Traction by Gino Wickman. And just to kind of refresh our listeners, if they haven't had a chance to go back and listen to that episode, but you talked about helping businesses define their vision and values, their targets, their marketing strategy, identifying the issues that could come up in their future. So I want you to just put that context in mind and talk about that from an RNG project standpoint. How can these projects fit into an overall vision and business strategy for a dairy operation?
I think there's a couple different ways. I think first and foremost, I think at some point in the future, now I don't know if we're 5 years out, 10 years out, 20 years out, our processors, they're already asking the questions because they're getting asked by their customers on the sustainability initiatives going on, in the milk supply that the processors are using, to convert into dairy products that ultimately they sell, on through the chain. So I think the sustainability story, I think at some point, I think there will be an expectation at the processor level that you need to have dairy RNG as part of your sustainability portfolio. So I think at some point, I think that it will be like your ticket to get into the game kind of a deal. So I think that's a piece of it. And then the other piece of it is, if I'm a dairy farm and I can turn, manure into methane into cash, that puts me at a competitive advantage against my competition that doesn't have the capability to convert manure to methane to cash. In some cases, I think there will be years, likely there will be years where you may break even or make just a little bit of money milking cows. And on a per cow basis, you could actually make more money selling gas than you do selling milk.
Wow. Did you ever think you'd be saying these words?
No, but really it reminds me a little bit is if you track back the development of the ethanol industry, 20, 25 years ago, these ethanol plants back then, they made all their money, converting corn into ethanol, and DDG was a byproduct, right? You almost had to give this stuff away just to get rid of it. Well, now you talk to ethanol plant managers and there's times when they may make a little bit of money converting corn into ethanol, but really the profit driver is the DDG and being able to monetize, the oil and the DDG coming out of that ethanol process. So I think I liken it very similar to, what we're seeing in the dairy RNG space to the ethanol industry where, in the past, manure has been a byproduct, right? Now, manure could be the difference between making money and not making money.
Okay. And Jay, when you think about those contracts and the length of time, and again, I'm going to jump back to one of your many hats, the family of business advising seat. And, these are projects that affect multiple generations of business partners. And I was talking with the producer one day who had not signed on to a project yet because he was in this in-between point. Do I take my carbon credits to the grave with me? Or do I sign my next generation up for a 20 to 30 year commitment that I'm not going to be around to see? Speak to that for a minute.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, most of these projects they are intended to be 20, 25, 30 year type projects. So it's only natural that the project developers want to tie up the manure supply for that long. So, I understand why they do it, but I would kind of have the same mindset that your producer did to say, you may want 20 years, but I'm only willing to give you 10, right? So I think there's obviously in any of these types of situations, there are points of negotiation. And I do think, the duration of the contract is a negotiable point. So don't go into a deal thinking that it has to be 20 years. I think there is some give and take that can be had. Now, the financial terms of the deal may change a little bit, but, again, it's that trade-off of how long do you want to essentially sign your kids up, to be able to have to perform under the terms of the contract. So 20 years, as we all know, a lot can happen in 20 years.
Yeah. And so at the end of the day, this isn't just a conversation about renewable energy. This is a conversation about the bigger picture, 20 to 30 year vision and business plan.
Yep. And also, too, realize that if you ever decide you want to sell the dairy, does that contract follow? Yes, I'm sure it does, right? So, know that the terms of a deal that you negotiate today may impact, or it will almost inevitably impact your ability. If you ever decide you want to sell the dairy, it's going to impact how that transfer happens. Is it a good deal? Is it a bad deal? How much time is left? Under the original agreement, all that stuff is going to impact the value of your dairy business.
Excellent.
In some cases, you think you're going to, that contract, is an asset, right? That it's going to generate positive cash flow. Who's to say that at some point it doesn't turn into a liability?
And so planning for both of those scenarios.
And there's just so much uncertainty around it now. It's impossible to predict the future, but there's just a lot of moving pieces of this whole dairy RNG thing right now. How many other states are gonna implement low carbon fuel standards? California has been the driving force behind this development, but Illinois, New York, there's other states that have adopted their version of California's LCFS. So, if we get more states, I don't think this thing's going away. Renewable energy, I do not think this is going to go away. It's probably going to look a little different 5 years from now than what it does today. But I don't see a future where dairy RNG is not a pretty critical piece if your dairy is large enough to where it actually makes sense to invest the capital.
Jay, between what you've shared, what Dr. Bob Nagel has shared, and what Susan has shared on this episode of the Uplevel Dairy Podcast, we're leaving dairy producers with a lot to think about, but also some strong tips and strong suggestions for how to look at RNG projects as far as the contracts that are going to be fair and valuable going forward, looking at the on-farm implications and the bigger picture of the financial piece as well. So thank you for joining us on the Uplevel Dairy Podcast. Thank you for listening to the Uplevel Dairy Podcast. I'm your host, Peggy Coffeen, and if you like what you heard today, go ahead and head on over to upleveldairy.com to read the blog and join the Uplevel Dairy email list so you can receive new podcasts, blogs, and special offers coming soon from Uplevel Dairy straight in your inbox. To listen to more episodes, head over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube, and don't forget to rate and review. Connect with me, Peggy, at peggy@upleveldairy.com, and follow Uplevel Dairy on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn.